I'd like to invite, therefore, Oswald Grübel, Dominic Barton, and Rhodes Scholar to come here and to take your seats. Where is Dominic? Before I take my seat and sit down, I'd just like to take 2 minutes to say something about the subject. The subject is the global economic power shift, wishful thinking, chimera, or reality. Unfortunately, Lubna Olayan is unable to be with us today and had to pull out at very short notice. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome not only Oswald Grübel, but also Dominic Barton and Rhodes Scholar. Oswald Grübel has spent a lifetime in banking with great success in Deutsche Bank, then in Credit Suisse as CEO, most recently and at present with UBS. And I'm told in Switzerland he's become a cult figure. So Aussie as he's known. It's great to have you here. Dominic Barton is a fellow member of the Commonwealth. He's a Canadian, has been with McKinsey for 25 years, and along with Rhodes Scholar, who's a television presenter with a very successful show with Al Jazeera, all three of these gentlemen are at the cutting edge of this issue. May I just introduce it very briefly as follows. I believe that the 20th century was the nearest we could have to a huge battle, debate, conflict, intellectual and practical, between capitalism and socialism. When I was a student at the London School of Economics, Russia, the USSR, and Eastern Europe were socialist. China was under the influence of Mao. India was under the influence of British Fabianism, the licensed Raj. Africa had 5-year plans, people who were introducing socialism. Latin America had its socialist ideologues, and in Europe there was Euro-Marxism. The battle was very clear. There was capitalism with private property rights, a respect for individual freedom, markets being able to work, and there was socialism with state control, with planning. And by the end of the 20th century, capitalism won that debate hands down. As a result, what we've seen is the emergence of countries such as the BRICS, China, Brazil, India, and Russia, who have been freed from socialist ideology and whose success has been quite extraordinary. And therefore this raises for all of us a number of questions. The one which the students have given to us, is this wishful thinking or is this something permanent? How should companies respond to this? Will it lead to a shift in political power as well as military power from west to east? And what are the implications for our global institutions, the UN, the IMF, the G20, the G7, and how should they adjust? The form of this panel is going to be, I'm going to ask each person to speak for a few minutes in introducing the subjects. We'll then have a little discussion among ourselves, and then I'm going to turn to you and invite questions or comments from yourselves. So I think that we'll start, if I may, with Mr. Grübel, and then Dominic, and Rhodes Scholar. So, Oswald.
We had quite a remarkable time in the last 15 years when globalization really started, and going so far as some people probably today arguing the Communist Party of China are better capitalists than anywhere else in the world. And that is what you hinted to, what we have to discuss. And normally power is going where the money is going. And we have the the West and the industrialized world in the last 10 years alone, I think, we have created hundreds of millions of jobs in the developing nations by outsourcing cheap production and paying with money which we deliberately devaluated as well. So we thought we might be on to a good thing here. And also, we forced the developing countries who produced all this wonderful stuff and took our money for it to invest the profits in our treasury bonds so that we can go on spending. And that seems to be, if you keep going on forever there, a good business proposition. Now, did power actually, and how far could they accumulate power in the last few years, and will it last? Can a country like China grow at 10% or 8% forever? As we know from experience, that at least is very difficult. So we are already surprised that it lasted as long as it did, the growth. What we also did, we engineered a world financial crisis, and again, it was not only the banks, there were governments and everybody was in there, but the politicians cleverly blamed the banks for it. Now, what are we doing? And the solution we have for that is suddenly we have to increase liquidity substantially at banks, and has already been. Most banks halve their balance sheet. We will increase capital, we will double capital at banks, and under Basel III by 2019. So I would think in the next 10 years, at the end of the 10 years in 2019, you will have overly liquid, overcapitalized banks, but till then, very little economic growth. On top of it, you have, through the transparency we created in government finances, especially in Europe, astonishing revelations, and which are not inflationary, they are deflationary, substantially deflationary. So we will see if these emerging economies, how they behave and how much they can actually rely on their own economy within the country and what they have established so far, how they will be faring there. So I would say at the moment the judgment is still out of a power shift, and but the next 10 years will be very important.
Thank you very much. Dominic.
I would start by saying I think that there is a power shift happening and it will continue, but I don't think it'll be a straight line, because Ozzy said, I think this is there's no way that economies can grow at 8 to 10% forever. And I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a shift in how those economies have to work. But the reason why I'm bullish about the shift now is from some underlying factors, and there's 4 I would just like to lay out. The first is urbanization. I think this is the first year in human history that we have more people in cities than we have in rural areas, and that is continuing at an incredible pace. There are 1.3 million people a week moving from rural areas to cities. And whether you're the Communist Party of China or whoever you are, you can't stop people from moving people from the rural areas to the cities. And from living in Shanghai for 6 years, seeing the government, the mayor's efforts to try and stem that tide, you can't do it. People are going to move. That actually is leading to significant productivity improvement and growth. And if you look at another just factoid, 600 cities in the world which represent about 50% of the GDP, if in the next 15 years, 133 of those cities will change, and 100 of those will come from China. And there's cities that we haven't heard of because of the growth that's going on. So I think that urbanization is a very important factor. To me, it's like gravity. It's happening. It's moving along. I think the second aspect relates a bit to something Ozzy said, which is a shift from being a manufacturing source or a factory to a consumption area. And you're seeing that happening now, too, in places like China, India, Indonesia, even Vietnam, where the consumption part of GDP is about 35 to 38%. In the Western world, it's reaching 75%. we're seeing that's going to drive a lot of growth, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the shifts occurring right now. I think a third big driver is actually education. I think in many of these Asian countries, and I don't want to generalize too much, but on the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, it's not food first, it's education. It's educate your children, then feed the family. And that focus on education, I think, is going to lead to a lot of human capital development and innovation and so forth. And the final point I would just say is long-term thinking. One of the things I worry about is in the West, we have very short-term thinking, primarily with governments, which are forced to, every 2 to 4 years, try and make decisions, where in these other places you've got, in the Singapores and so forth of the world, you've got 10 to 15-year views. One example I've given is we were working with the new president of Korea. When he came into power, he asked for a 60-year vision. And I remember talking to him and saying, you mean 6, not 60, right? He said, no, 60. And I said, how the hell can you even think past 15 years? And he goes, that's our tradition. We have nothing. We're a piece of dirt in between China and Japan. We have to plan, we have to think, we have to develop things ahead. And I think that long-term thinking is a source of competitive advantage, which is something we have to look at. So these are factors which to me suggest that it's going to continue. The thing I worry about is volatility, social unrest, which I think is what China has to be looking at and knows that the model that they have now, which has worked very successfully today, is going to be difficult when you all of a sudden have 900 million people in cities that have cell phones and have access. There's 150 million people in China joined the internet last year. These are things that they're going to have to grapple with and deal with. Social inequality, the income gap is rising. And we should never forget, I'm not trying to be a fear monger, but you think that we've forgotten about SARS and the H1N1. Big parts of these parts of the world are very, very rural, like in the Middle Ages. And those shocks can hit the place as well. So I'm bullish on the long-term direction, but I think it's going to be a little more volatile than we've seen.
Dominic, thank you. Rhodes.
Well, Griffiths, thank you. And Dr. Ackerman, Philip Erzinger, and the remarkable students at this gathering, congratulations on such a great event. There's so many thought leaders here. I feel very out of place. But thank you very much for having a chance to talk. I mean, I can only really give a media perspective. It's kind of nice also to be in a situation where, when I say I'm from Al Jazeera, we don't have to lock the doors because people are running screaming for them. And I do remind people at conferences that, look, the most dangerous word in the world has become the. The is the most dangerous word in the world if you say it in Arabic, because it's al. Because you stick al in front of anything, it becomes dangerous. Al-Qaeda, Al-Aqsa, Al Jazeera. And then I remember Americans, they have Al Gore. And of course, but they started with Al Capone. But anyway, so the media perspective is really all I can offer. And it's been an interesting time because we've seen what a double-edged sword the media can be. Al Jazeera itself went through so many transitions from being the darling of America in 1996 when it launched as the Arabic channel and was bringing what was considered democratic TV to the Middle East, to becoming, the bane of Donald Rumsfeld and the Bush administration after 2001 when America went into Afghanistan and the Al Jazeera journalists would not embed. So showing collateral damage and civilian casualties and so on, of course, they began to really hate it. And then we launched the English channel in 2006. And again, people were very wary of the brand. But now, of course, it's become the darling again of America because it's really putting the cameras on the streets. The double-edged sword aspect of it is that it's created incredible accountability, which, again, for the political shifts we're seeing in the Middle East, is great because it's harder for governments to hide the facts and hide the information. It's much more out there, and the people themselves are providing it through cell phone cameras and Twitter and so on. Although conventional TV is still obviously the most powerful tool. And then on the other side, it's also one that the regulation of the media, it's become such a free fall that people don't really know where the information is coming from anymore. With citizen journalism, it's easy to promote propaganda, easy for disinformation to also get out there. Al Jazeera did something very interesting with the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia and around the Arab world. They actually took all the information possible and put it out, saying we will crowdsource to give a clear indication of whether this information is accurate or not. That it's almost like saying, here's the image, and then everyone will tell us whether it's accurate or not. And it was kind of an interesting way to do it. It's kind of a risky way to do it, because until the information settles, I mean, say, for example, there's, pictures of Tahrir Square, and the tweeting begins. The first lot start tweeting, oh, there's trouble in Tahrir Square, there are government snipers picking out civilians. Then, of course, the propaganda tweets start, no such thing, it's the protesters who are creating the trouble, and they're the ones, stirring everything up. Then, of course, more tweets come in from civilians. No, and the mass of information coming from the honest side, if you like, the right side, eventually determines whether or not this picture is right or not. So it's kind of an interesting way to do it in a very risky way. But I think the media's growth across the world, not just now, of course, BBC World Service TV, CNN International, Al Jazeera English, we've got Russia Today, we've got France 24, Deutsche Welle, Euronews, all these are growing. And I think there's, and Bloomberg now as well, there's more and more accountability out there. And I think that's quite a good thing for making sure that the public is aware. As I say, the bad side is the expectations change. I feel sorry for Barack Obama. I mean, being asked to explain in 100 days why he hasn't made everything right. It's a very tough judgment. The years and years of accumulated problems, if you like, can't be fixed overnight. So the other thing is that the media nitpicks everything in such detail that we start to lose perspective. And this idea of a 60-year plan is fascinating, because I don't think we think past 60 hours most of the time. So the only thing I can really say is I think the media will play a big part in shaping where things go. But again, it's still such a grey area for where the media itself is going that it's still very much a landscape that hasn't been fully painted.
I wonder if I can just ask you one question, and then I'm going to throw it open to debate. If you look at what's happening in Western countries at present, since China came into the world economy, this Iron Curtain collapsed, 2 billion people entered the world economy as consumers and producers. And you look at the distribution of income in our countries, and you see a divergence between the compensation of knowledge workers and unskilled workers. And as a result, large numbers of young people being unemployed. At the same time, you look at Singapore, you look at China, India, you look at the amount of money they're putting into research and development, and they're not going to be exporting in the future just cheap goods to us, but they're going to be competing, I think, in high tech and areas like that. And my question is this: against that background, what do you think are the chances that we're going to see the rise of protectionism? Dominic, do you want to go first?
Sure.
And
I think what's
McKinsey, we assume McKinsey answers all questions.
No, we don't. We don't.
With
we
equal
don't,
ease,
We often get them wrong, so I don't want to. I actually think what's remarkable in the last little while is how protectionism hasn't come on as strong as it should, and I think that's something we should be grateful for. But the pressures are there, and if you look at places, just to your point, Spain has a 42% youth unemployment rate, and you see that problem that's there. The knowledge workers, as you say, that are losing their jobs. It's not the union worker that's just losing their jobs anymore in the U.S. It's actually the university-educated worker that's losing the job, and so I do think that there's going to be more pressure for that. One thing I've noticed a recent increase in, literally in the last 12 months, is more countries having competitiveness councils where they get CEOs, business leaders, government leaders, education people to think about how to make the country competitive. I think that's a very positive thing in the sense of when it's competitiveness. I think we have to hope it doesn't shift to how do we make sure that all the jobs are being created here when you've got governments that are, by the way, being elected, again, on very short-term measures and don't really have the patience to put in place some of the long-term things that are there. So I think the pressure is going to go up on that side, and I hope that we can, hold the fort on that side, but also I think take responsibility for dealing with helping the unemployed. The 42% youth unemployment in Spain is a business problem. It's not a government problem. So we should all be involved in figuring out how to do it. If we don't, we're going to have another business problem, which is protectionism. Yeah.
Oswald.
Taking your example in Spain, I think there's an education problem as well, and skill problem, learning skills, and putting some government money actually in making sure that people learn some jobs and how to do the jobs. I think there was a huge competition created in the world for unskilled labor, and that's why the gap widened. But not necessarily, as you know as well as I, in banking we would love to pay less, but it doesn't work. And there are not enough people who have the skill to are trained well enough and want to go in these jobs, and so we have to go on paying relatively high and are getting accused of all these things. So generally in the world, yes, there was probably in the last few months, if you listen to some of our European leaders, you could think, oh, God, what are they doing? They're going back to protectionism and so on, and the kind of stuff they were uttering. But I think, as was mentioned, the transparency which is created today does not allow that really in such a bad way as we know it from the past.
Just a quick thought. I'm not an economist, but just a quick thought that there's a sense, I get a sense that there's so little predictability nowadays. This instability factor has gone up. Everything from gauging currencies. The mighty dollar is not so mighty anymore. So much was pegged on the dollar. It's much harder for especially smaller nations which don't have that much slack to be able to predict what's going to happen. And I think they have to start thinking about measures that will give them some degree of protection. There'll be social pressures, as you say, for jobs and some kind of stability. So I think the sort of the time of the dollar, the time of the big guys has been weakened. So maybe more regional power bindings, but more regional blocks. But I think that the unpredictability is what's driving a lot of countries to have to try to find some stability, and that may create greater protectionism.
Now I'm going to stand up. I'm afraid I'm looking into total darkness at present, and I couldn't see any hand. Now the lights have come on. Please stand up, say who you are, ask your question. I prefer it if it could be brief rather than lengthy. So do exercise self-discipline. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Daniel Walker with the Swiss Foreign Ministry. Gentlemen, other than an economic power shift to Asia and China, isn't there also a political power shift to the Asia-Pacific? Riz Khan said as much in so many words. But let's face it, there is also a political power shift towards the Asia-Pacific. It might not be permanent. It might not be as big as quite a few think, but I think we have to realize that the power shift is ongoing and it has already happened in some way. Thank you.
Is there a political power shift, and will there be a military power shift? Rez, let's start with you.
Yeah, just a quick thought. I think that the thing is that countries like China and India are realizing they have greater clout and are putting themselves out there much more. I mean, it's a simple thing in Davos. I saw a far greater presence of both the Indian and Chinese media. I think both realize that engagement through, if you like, the established pathways of, gatherings, international conferences and so on. Also having, CCTV is now expanding, looking for a greater place in the American market. I met with some of their people in Washington, D.C. So I think that China and India in particular are realizing they've got the kind of clout that they can build. And I don't know if it'll be as much direct political, because I think this sort of economic power has given them so much more political clout anyway. So I don't think there's any need for an outright sort of political, chest beating kind of posture.
Dominic.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been an increase in soft power, not the hard power. And I would, I think one thing that we're not as aware of as we should be, if you look at the trade routes that are now the fastest growing in the world, they're the trade routes that we used to see 1,000 years ago. It's kind of like we're going back in history. But you see the linkage between China and the Middle East very, very deep. It's the fastest growing trade route on earth, the old Silk Road. That's moving, and you're seeing the flows of people China in Africa. I think China's the one that's rediscovered Africa first, not the West, and people are wondering what the hell is going on and how does that work, but they're there. If you look at what many South American countries are now doing in terms of their diplomacy, much more shifting from Europe towards Asia in terms of the number of consulates and so forth. So I think there's a lot going on. You're seeing in education, resources, infrastructure. Ozzy, I think, mentioned the amount of capital that's now held in Asia. That's I'd argue, soft power, but more of the capital, the China Investment Corporation, Temasek, Kazana. There's a lot of these funds. They're the ones that are investing around the world. You see a lot more people now in the road shows. You got to stop in Beijing and Singapore and so forth. So I think that's happening and will continue to occur.
Just to expand on that, of course, there's the string of pearls, the infrastructure that, for example, China's created in terms of linking its ports, not just from the Middle East, but across Africa. So it's almost creating a global infrastructure for its pathways. And it exports a lot of people to Africa to work there. So it's not so much that it's building say, perhaps the local population's job market.
Yes, I agree as well. There is a little bit of political shift and also probably just a little bit of military shift, but I think it's mainly due to the weakness of our administrations. And
So do you have a message for the Swiss Foreign Office?
Swiss are neutral.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here, which I can see even in the darkness. Is there another person after this who'd like to speak? Gentleman right at the back, and then maybe there's a lady somewhere who has... I see a sea of male faces. It would be nice to have... Okay. Gentleman here.
My name is Ravi Chaudhary from CNX Consulting, New Delhi. That's my profession, but my passion is global governance. Most of the talk relating to power, I find, tends to focus on economic power, military power, soft power. I wish to put forth the concept that the globalization of power, as I perceive, is going to change all these. We are going to enter an era where the power of human mind, the power of conscience, is going to be more dominant than these three powers we talked about. What does it mean? This means that the power will move and stay where it is willingly shared, not only within the society which people administer, but also across humanity. And that will be the real effective center of power in the days to come. How long you see this phenomena moving towards to?
Thank you very much. I thought for a minute you were going to start a lecture. It was so eloquent, but I'm glad you made it a question. Who would like to say it? It was very thoughtful. Riz, why
Just
don't
a quick thought. It's interesting. I was born in the Middle East. I'm of Indian and Pakistani heritage, raised in Britain and very British in many ways, and now in America, living in America 18 years. And it's interesting to watch, and I travel a lot, so I get to see these sort of trends across the world. It's interesting how there's something about the American lifestyle, this idea of freedom, the right to be able to do what one wants to, how it latches on. It's part of human nature. So consumerism, it's a very strong force. We're seeing in India and China that the driving forces are essentially consumerism, not humanity and spiritualism. It's kind of strange that's been very much put aside. Is it time to pray or to work on the iPad? And I think the iPad wins out, unfortunately. So I think the tendency is, I think that human nature is driven by these forces of wanting freedom of expression and freedom of consumerism. So I don't know, as much I think it's a terrible trend, but I think that the humanity aspect is in some ways been forgotten. Ironically, we're seeing it come back round in America, where people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett say, well, actually, I have so much I don't know what to do with it. Let's do something good with it. So maybe it comes full circle, but we're seeing the other end of it, India and China, people who've had very little saying, well, what about my turn? So I don't think that the humanity, the human factor, as you say, the power of the human spirit, which would be a uniting force, can overcome what is really a sort of the economic and consumer drive right now. That's really my fear.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask, time's going on. Gentleman at the back, that's right. The same hand that went up earlier. Can we get a microphone to this gentleman? And then the great Dutchman.
Good morning. My name's Lester, currently a student in Japan. Now, the first question was about power shift. Now, if there will be a political power shift, how will these new players look like? And how are they going to use their power?
Thank you very much. Dominic, if there is a political power shift, I take it more than just soft power, but maybe harder power. I mean, do you see it in terms of global agencies? We've gone from the G8 to the G20. Do you see an increasing movement in that direction, or regional power blocks rising?
I think that some of the obvious ones will be the broader mix. I think that the China's, the BRICS, Nigeria, they're going to play a bigger role in the world. I think getting international organizations to work well, I think, is one of the biggest conundrums that's out there. I think if we could, it's very difficult to let go of the past when you're thinking of the future, so I'm not that optimistic about the changes. Maybe the next generation is going to be able to change it, hearing the earlier speaker. But I think that what we're going to begin to see is more of I do think that China, Brazil, I think Nigeria, Russia, these countries are going to throw their weight around a little more. They rely on the rest of the world. I mean, China, it's a mutual assured destruction, right? I mean, China, for all of its growth and so forth, does require the U.S. consumer to continue to move. They're linked, and with the treasury bills and so forth, they're talked about. So I don't think there's luckily a sort of a link with them, but I think they're going to throw their weight more around. I think the issue of resources will be one area to watch. When you have 900 million new middle-class consumers that want to do the materialist thing and buy the cell phones and the scooters and so forth, I think where you get the resources will be a big issue, and I think that's going to be an increasing area of tension. I don't know about military type of activity, but I think whether it's trying to use companies to acquire assets, we've seen that recently in Canada, that's going to, I think, lead to the change. So I think the hot spot will be around resources, especially from these rapidly growing countries, trying to secure it.
And now, if you can stand up, thank you very much. We can have a microphone. This is from a banker, so I think it's to you, Oswald.
I'm Koen Teulings, private citizen from Brussels in Belgium. My question is about accountability of the media. The technology enables the media to poke into everything and into everywhere. And I wonder whether there still should be some room in society for respect, discretion, privacy, and if we want governments and corporations to be accountable, what is the accountability in the media actually?
Before we ask Riz to respond, I'm going to ask a banker, Oswald Grübel, to respond. The Swiss know a lot about privacy.
Yeah, we know all about media and banks lately, but I think it's something you cannot stop anymore. And the question is really to find out where the moral barriers are. You cannot government impose them because that is going against the trend at the moment. We have seen what happens to government to try to stop internet and stuff like that. So the media has to find its own moral rules, and they are at the moment different from country to country.
Riz?
Yeah, I think actually I was going to joke that your question is now on YouTube, so it's question of privacy doesn't exist. No, actually, it's a really big issue, and it's something. When the WikiLeaks stuff came out, I was kind of dismayed. I'm considered maybe a bit of a dinosaur in the media, in that I did years of training at the BBC, and we were taught to take out the adjectives. I saw a young writer once give a piece of copy to the editor, and the editor looked at it and said, "The long-running bloody civil war in Sri Lanka. How many civil wars do you know that are not bloody?" And crossed it out. So we were constantly being take out the adjectives, be neutral, facts and figures. And I think the media has changed for the worse. I think training has gone down the plug hole. No one's really training people properly to be able to gauge what is ethical and moral and so on. I think though there are laws, Al Jazeera is regulated by Ofcom in Britain, which is one of the strictest codes of broadcasting regulation in the world, if not the strictest. So we actually we have rules and regulations, but I guess the public is also driving what the media provides. And it's this vicious circle of they want to see more reality TV, we give them more reality TV. They want to see more gory stuff, we give them more gory stuff. And I don't think it's a good thing. When WikiLeaks, the papers, all this information from WikiLeaks came out, I thought, actually, it's not that we have a right to know this, to be honest. I didn't think, great, we know all this, look at this. There's equally an argument then all my emails should be exposed and people can say, oh, he doesn't like this person, he does like this person and so on. I don't think we have a right to know that kind of stuff. It's a curiosity and we're interested, obviously. But I think we've become very hungry for we're voyeuristic. We've become hungry for reality TV, even in our news. So I agree with the gentleman. I think the accountability factor is huge. I don't know if the public will ever demand it. That's the problem. I think the public to some degree drives the downward spiral.
There's time for one last question. Gentleman there. Yes. After which, I'm just going to ask the panel just to give a final closing thought.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chang Ziqian from Singapore. My question pertains to the idea of maintaining long-term planning, as mentioned as one of the key drivers for the shift in power, and to maintain this delicate balance with the latitude of allowing change in governments in liberal politics. Are they mutually exclusive? And if they are not, how are they supposed to coexist together? Thank you.
Did you get the question?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that the issue is, though, that there's so many places, there's so many models, if you like, of governance and rule, if you like, that it's very hard to generalize. What we're seeing in the Arab world has shown that that there's only a limited sustainability for dictatorship and sort of despotic rule, or even heavily autocratic rule. Years ago, I interviewed Lee Kuan Yew, who said, if I hadn't been the way I was, Singapore wouldn't be what it is today. And ironically, there's some truth in that. And even with Mahathir Mohamad, the way he governed Malaysia had an impact on the development of that country. So it's very hard to gauge. Each country needs its own model. I heard a story recently, I told a couple of people at dinner last night, that Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin, and Muammar Gaddafi were meeting quietly together. And God came down and said, listen, I've got bad news for you. The world only has 2 weeks left. And it's your job to go back and tell your people. So Barack Obama went back to America and said, good people of America, fellow Americans, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that God came and spoke to me, and that shows he exists, and that reinforces our faith, our monotheistic faith. The bad news is the world's going to end in 2 weeks. So then Vladimir Putin went back to Russia and said, people of Russia, I have bad news and bad news. The bad news is that God spoke to me, which means that our atheistic beliefs are completely down the plug hole as well. And the other bad news is the world is going to end in 2 weeks. But Muammar Gaddafi went back to Libya and said, Libyans, I have good news and good news. First, the good news is that God came and spoke to me, which proves he exists. The other good news is he said, I'm your leader for life. So, so in short, I think there are a lot of people who won't be willing to give up power too easily just yet. So,
Dominic?
I think on the question about whether you can have long-term planning in a democratic system, I actually think you can. I think that there are some parts of planning that should not be subject to voting all the time. For example, imagine if we all voted every week to what the interest rates should be. It would be a horrendous place. And I think we need to move more of some of the competitiveness and economic side outside of at least the 2 to 4 year cycle. And I think that actually could be done.
Can I thank you very much for your questions? And now I'd like to just ask members of the panel to give a final thought on what they've heard. Oswald.
I think
silence, the final thought.
Indeed. What is the good news? What is the bad news? The good news is that you will have low interest rates for the next 10 years to come. The bad news is you won't get a lot richer. But on the other hand, I think that will help in the years to come to where we sort out all our own problems with the help of transparency, which we created, in which the news keeps on digging in and bringing to the top, that we have to sort out our problems we got ourselves in secrecy. And so politicians told the electorate everything is fine and don't worry. Whenever they say don't worry, start worrying. And so it probably takes the best part of the 10 years to sort that all out. And the question is then, how much money will we send and how much orders will we give to the emerging countries? And do the emerging countries have generated enough economic power in their own countries to sustain that period? I think it is at best a 50-50 equation, and but we all have to be optimistic, and so but you cannot generate global growth with shrinking banks. Please believe me. And that's what will be happening in the next 10 years.
Dominic.
I think that, first of all, the next 10 to 15 years are going to be, I think, the most exciting that we'll have seen in 150 years in terms of all these changes going on. I think there will be and there is a power shift. It won't be a straight line. I'm very optimistic about it. I'm optimistic about it because I think what's coming into the leadership of the world is literally hundreds of millions of talented people that we're going to draw on. I think it's going to be a huge source of innovation and ideas and so forth. So I'm very bullish, even though I believe it's going to be a very volatile, exciting time.
I think so too. I think the information age is really helping the world to interconnect, and hopefully that will break down some of the barriers and prejudices that exist, and I think perhaps make governments more accountable. Things are improving. I sort of will end it with a little story I heard of how things used to be, perhaps, where a teacher had some young children about 6, 7 years old. They came back from their afternoon recess, and the teacher said, "Now you're back from your break, we'll do some spelling." And she pointed to one little boy and said, "Michael, what did you do during the break?" He said, I was playing in the sandbox with Catherine, miss." "Well, Michael, if you can spell sand correctly, you can have a cookie." So he confidently says, "S-A-N-D, miss." She goes, "Very good, you get a cookie." He said, "Catherine, you were playing in the sandbox with Michael." "Yes, miss, we built sandcastles. It was great. We were laughing. It was so much fun." "Well, Catherine, if you can spell box," now think about it, and this poor little girl's only 6, 7 years old, "but if you can spell box correctly, you can have a cookie." So she's a bit nervous and says, "B-O-X, miss?" "Very good, Catherine, you get a cookie." "Mohammed, did you play in the sandbox with Catherine and Michael?" She said, "No, miss, I wanted to, but they threw sand at me and they called me names and they wouldn't let me play with them." She said, "Mohammed, that sounds like blatant racial discrimination. If you can spell blatant racial discrimination." So hopefully things have changed a lot since then, and I remain an optimist.
Can I just say in conclusion that I do think a sort of consensus has emerged. One is that there is a shift of economic power. Maybe it's not as irreversible as some people think. I love your point. It's not a straight line. There's so much uncertainty. There's volatility. There's a lot that can, happen. But on the other hand, I love, secondly, the potential that there is. Market economies are very open economies, and very open to talent, to ideas, to innovation. And therefore, it's a very exciting time. And I think the third thing that's really hit me, and it follows on really from Ali Wynn's earlier statement, that your generation, Ali, faces a tremendous challenge of leadership. Because I do think the institutions which we have are by and large still those which were formed in the Second World War after the disaster of the interwar years and the Second World War itself. The 21st century and the pace of technological change and the shifts which are taking place, I think, demand a huge challenge of leadership. Otherwise, I think we do risk protectionism on a scale which would be, in my judgment, disastrous. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give the members of the panel a big hand?